welcome to this high-level dialogue on the theme of a further comprehensive deepening of reforms, connotation, prospects, and opportunities. This dialogue is co-produced by CGTN and the China Institute for Innovation and Development Strategy, or CIIDS. I'm Xu Qinduo. As we know, China stands at a pivotal juncture with a new round of reforms. Further deepening of reforms represents not only a critical pathway for China's economic transformation, but also holds significant implications for global economic growth. Joining me for this important topic are Salih Kebzabo, former Prime Minister of Chad; Issam Sharaf, former Prime Minister of Egypt; Jarana Kanal, former Prime Minister of Nepal; Yves Le Dain, former Prime Minister of Belgium; Li Junru, Executive Vice Chairman of the Academic Committee of CIIDS, former Vice President of the Party School of the CPC Central Committee; Peng Sen, President of the China Society of Economic Reform and the former Vice Chairman of the National Development and Reform Commission; Chi Fulin, President of the China Institute for Reform and Development; and Madame Chen Wenling, Chief Economist of the China Center for International Economic Exchanges. Welcome to this special dialogue. Now I'd like to invite our guests to give us a few remarks on their understanding of China's further deepening of reforms. Each guest will be giving about 3 minutes. We'll start with Mr. Li Junru.
如果要问今天中国的政治水域里面叫得最响的、最吸引人的是什么概念呢？就是改革。
If you want to ask what is the most popular and attractive concept among Chinese political terms today, it is reform. Why do we attach so much importance to reform? First, it is determined by the original aspiration and the mission of the Communist Party of China, which is to seek happiness for the Chinese people and rejuvenation for the Chinese nation. Second, China's way of thinking determines that it should start from the problem. Third, it is determined by its working mechanism. The reform of the third plenary session of the 18th CPC Central Committee is called Comprehensively Deepening Reform. Comprehensively deepening reform is not adding the words deepening and comprehensively in front of the word reform. It is a professional political term that refers to the reform with an overall goal of modernizing China's system and capacity for governance. From the third plenary session of the 18th Central Committee to the present, or from the 18th National Congress to the present, we have held 20 plenary sessions, and 6 of the 20 plenary sessions were about institutional reform. So, comprehensively deepening reform is not the exclusive term of the third plenary session. The issues discussed today may not only be discussing the connotation of comprehensively deepening reform. I think this question needs to be studied carefully. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Mr. Li. And next we have Issam Sharaf.
Well, let me first try to describe China as I see it. China is a growing power, growing ability, and it's balanced by growing responsibility. So both growing ability of China and the internal demand cannot be done without reform. Also, the responsibility and assisting the countries in the global level is also required reform. But maybe it's another addition to the reform, which is based on the opening or high standard opening up. So for China to stay as it is, just stopping reform is not an option. So China has to continue, and I want to say, to add also, so there is a continuous process, which is reform development, high quality development, high standard, opening up. It's continuous. And as the situation requires, it could be changed, reform could be changed, and so development and also the opening up. On the other hand, China is actually helping the world through two things, very briefly. A fundamental concept, or actually I call it philosophical concept, which is building a community of a shared future. That's actually can balance competition and cooperation. And the 4 global initiatives also as a mechanism for countries to cooperate with China to achieve global development.
Thank you, Mr. Sharaf. And next we have Mr. Peng Sen, please.
20届三中全会有一个很重要的决定，就是到2035年全面建成高水平社会主义市场经济体制。
A very important decision of the third plenary session of the 20th Central Committee is to build a high-level socialist market economy system in an all-round way by 2035. I think this is the first time such a proposal has been made, and it is also a very difficult task. Here are a few of my understandings. Firstly, the high-level socialist market economy system is the latest achievement of ideological emancipation and practical exploration in China's reform over the past 40 years. Because at the beginning of China's reform, there was no target model, nor did China copy foreign models, and it was completely explored in the process of reform. At that time, the most simple truth in China was that it was a dead end not to reform. After decades of exploration, we have established such a target model of the socialist market economy system. After the initial establishment and continuous improvement of the socialist market economy system, this time we propose to build a high-level socialist market economy system in an all-round way by 2035. I think China's reform has entered a new stage. In terms of goal orientation, a high-level market economy system must have more creative, more dynamic, and more competitive market players, that is, micro-enterprises. It must have a high-level and high-standard unified national market. At the same time, there should be a perfect and effective macro-governance system and also a new economy system with a high-level opening up. I think these things are indispensable, and there must be a more complete system. Speaking of the problem orientation, after more than 40 years of reform, there are still some problems. The market system is yet to be perfected. The microeconomy, especially the private sector, lacks confidence, and the relationship between the government and the market has not yet been strengthened out. These problems must be solved as a hard knot in the next step. Otherwise, we will not be able to build a high-level market economy system. Finally, a high-level socialist market economy system must also be a more efficient economy. Looking back on China's reform over the past 40 years, our economy has developed rapidly. Our society has been stable for a long time, and most importantly, we have adhered to market-oriented reform and contributed to world growth. I also believe that China's goal of establishing a high-level socialist market economy system will make greater contributions to the stable and peaceful growth of the world economy in the next decade. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peng Sen. Next, we have Yves Latam, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. I would like to add to the conversation by looking at the item through a European lens. I think that globally speaking, and certainly from the viewpoint of the European Union, we are confronted with the need of what I would call a kind of reset of the interaction between China on the one hand and the external world on the other hand. From the European Union, we have an important need of resetting the relations because we left them, I think it was in 2020, with stopping the conversation and debate and negotiations on the comprehensive agreement on investment. This was a major political mistake, I think, from the side of the European Union, and I think we should be aware of that we have to find ways to deblock this conversation on top of the, let's say, the documents that have been discussed in the bilateral conversations between the European Union and China. Last but not least, there is the incoming new US administration, and also this major political fact of the next couple of years will induce the need for a reset of the EU-China relations. On the blocked dialogue, I think we should, as soon as possible, come to a concrete, constructive agenda between the European Union and China to kind of deblock the situation as it was left with the comprehensive agreement on investment 3 to 4 years ago. In terms of the incoming Trump administration, I think very important is that Europe, in a good dialogue with China there, managed to build up its own position, which should be different, not in conflict with the United States, but different, taking into account the typical characteristics and the specific interests of the European Union.
Thank you, Mr. Ladam. And next we have Saleh Kabzabou, please.
Bonsoir tout le monde. Je voudrais exprimer d'abord
I would like to say that at our level, an accurate and profound understanding of China's reform is incomplete because we are not a player in this global game. It's not that we are absolutely not involved, and I'm talking about Africans. But I still want to say that we are watching China and the developments that China has achieved with all the reforms it has carried out so far. It is correct to recognize that the Chinese government has been sticking to its reform program to achieve the changes we observe today. And I believe that, as far as we are concerned, we have a lot to learn, because the Europeans themselves have said that they also have a lot to learn. I would like to talk about one important issue in particular, the situation in the world today. We notice that there are wars everywhere, big wars are being fought, and China is not involved in the world's wars. And I think it is very important that it can focus on solving its own problems, continue reforms, and not interfere in the affairs of other countries. China is at the forefront in almost every field of development. China is a big country, and today's China is a good example for us, and we need to pay closer attention to it. And I think we have a lot to learn. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kabzabou. And next we have Jalana Kanal, please.
I think China is a socialist country, and since 1978, China started to opening up and reform in socialist system. At the same time, the modernization process was developed. Slowly and gradually, the productive forces very rapidly developed in China. And China, actually, within 40 years' time, China became a modern, thriving economy, a modernized economy. And China is strengthening its strength in every sector, particularly in economy, in technology, in management, and defense. In every aspect, China is strengthening itself. And at the same time, the productive forces and the technology has been developing well. So China is strengthening in the domestic arena. At the same time, China is expanding its influence around the world, particularly in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Oceania. And at the same time, the global South is also strengthening well because of the reform inside the country. The country's international influence has been enhanced well. So China is becoming a country for enhancing peace and development everywhere in the world at this time. So I think in this modern world, China has become a country for enhancing peace and stability in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kanal. Next we have Mr. Chiflin, please.
我就结构性改革是中国全面深化改革的突出特点和重大任务这样3句话。
I'd like to make 3 remarks on structural reform as a prominent feature and major task of China's comprehensively deepening reform. First, China is in a critical period of structural transformation lasting for the next 10 years. Whether it's the industrial structure, the consumption structure, or the urban and rural structure, there's room for improvement by 10 to 15 percentage points. Take service consumption as an example. If we increase the service consumption of urban and rural residents from 45% to 60% in the next 10 years, it's not only an important symbol of China's transformation from a large manufacturing country to a large service innovation country, but it will also help China maintain a growth rate of 4.5% to 5.5%. It will not only attract foreign investment to China, but also make China continue to contribute about 30% to global growth. Second, China's economic transformation has cyclical contradictions, but more importantly, it has structural contradictions. In this context, we need not only a package of incremental stimulus policies, but also an important breakthrough in structural reform. The core problem is that China's urbanisation level is too low to play a major role in promoting China's transformation. According to our standards, China's industrialisation rate reached its peak in 2011, but so far our urbanisation rate is only 66.16%, and the urbanisation rate of the registered population is only 48.3%. Therefore, if the urbanisation rate of the registered population reaches 65% in the next 10 years, there'll be at least tens of trillions in consumer demand. More importantly, it will push China's transformation from a big agricultural country to a truly modern and innovative country. Finally, China's structural reform is profound, long-term and comprehensive. So if we take the urbanisation of migrant workers as an example, 298 million migrant workers have not been urbanised so far. To urbanise 298 million migrant workers requires an investment demand of 16 trillion to 20 trillion yuan, which involves a series of issues. It requires not only the financial investment of the central government, but also the state-owned capital to support this matter. It requires not only land reform in our countryside, but also the adjustment of our land market and policy. It requires us not only to invigorate the private economy, but also to make up for the shortcomings of basic public services in urban and rural areas. Structural reform is the key to solving China's problem of insufficient aggregate demand, the key to China's successful transformation, and the key to dealing with the relationship between China and the world.
Thank you, Mr. Chi. And let's move on to the next stage of a further and in-depth discussion on all those topics mentioned earlier. We also started with Mr. Li Junru. You know, the different guests mentioned the different topics on there. Share with us your response to that.
他们讲那个改革都很具体，而且很深入，有的很精准，非常好。
When they talked about reform, they were very specific and in-depth, and some of them were very precise and very good. From the perspective of historical comparison, what is the connotation of comprehensively deepening reform? Chairman Mao Zedong solved the problem with 4 Chinese characters. Which 4 Chinese characters? 组织起来, which means to get organized. Farmers' cooperatives were organized, labor unions were organized, and intellectuals were organized through various organizations, generating tremendous strength with the whole country changed. But another problem occurred when getting organized, as everything has 2 sides. The people and the talent could not flow, and the vitality was insufficient. Therefore, Deng Xiaoping's reform was also about 4 Chinese characters, 活跃起来, to get active, which enlivened China, allowing farmers to flow and allowing workers and urban people to start their own businesses. Because of that, China generated huge productive forces and became the 2nd largest economy in the world. But there was chaos in the process of getting active, which made Deng Xiaoping so anxious that he tried to solve the problem by doing 2 jobs at one time, adhering to reform and cracking down on crime at the same time, and building material civilization and spiritual civilization at the same time. Then Xi Jinping put forward a concept that is to deepen reform comprehensively, solving the problems from the institutional aspect of governance system and governance capacity. His idea was to be active as well as orderly, which is 活而有序. So we started from getting organized to get active, and then to get active as well as orderly. Then the third plenary session of the 20th CPC Central Committee raised new questions, making governance-based reform conducive to development. So the title of the document this time is Resolution of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China on Further Deepening Reform Comprehensively to Advance Chinese Modernization. The third plenary session of the 20th CPC Central Committee not only adheres to the governance-based reform since the third plenary session of the 18th CPC Central Committee, but also wants to adapt reform to development. What is adaptation to development? First, it should focus on development. Second, it should be conducive to development. And third, it should promote development. So, in fact, there are 4 stages in China's strategy. So I think the connotation of comprehensively deepening reform and further advancing modernization, in fact, is what the third plenary session of the CPC Central Committee said. That is, to better adapt governance to development.
Okay, Mr. Peng Seng, I have a question for you. You know, next round of reforms, we've talked a lot about that. So, in this round of reform, what are the key challenges? What do you think are the most challenging aspects or issues we have to deal with?
我想呢，就刚才我讲到了高水平社会主义市场经济体制。
I just talked about the high-level socialist market economy system, which needs to make up for some shortcomings of our existing system as soon as possible. For example, the development of our factor market is relatively lagging behind, and there's a lack of confidence in the investment of our private economy. In addition, the relationship between the government and the market has not been fully straightened out. Solving these problems is the most important and crucial task for us to deepen reform in the next step. Of course, solving these problems is not only for goal orientation, but it is to establish a high-level socialist market economy system, and finally to provide a strong driving force and institutional guarantee for our Chinese modernization. After more than 40 years of rapid growth, China is indeed under the pressure of an economic downturn. Therefore, we should solve this problem through a large number of incremental policies and counter-cyclical monetary and fiscal policies. But it is a short-term countermeasure. In the medium and long term, we must solve some structural problems, including the coordinated development of urban and rural areas, finding good solutions to balance between consumption and investment. China's consumption rate is low, and in the next 5 or 10 years, can China's consumption rate, which is 10%, 20%, or 30% lower than that of other high-income countries, be increased by 10 or 15 points? If that happens, China's economic growth will be greatly stimulated. China's real reform can provide a powerful impetus for the long-term and stable development of China's economy.
为中国经济的长期稳定发展能够提供一个强大动力。
Thank you, Mr. Peng Seng. You mentioned about the lack of business confidence in investment from the private sector. So I think people understand probably what are the reasons and how can we fix that kind of a lack of confidence?
这个涉及到的主要的问题啊，还是对民营经济的一个定位啊。
The main problem involved is the positioning of the private economy. China's private economy and China's socialist market economy are interdependent. Without the socialist market economy, private economy cannot develop. From the early 1980s, there were only 1.8 million self-employed people in the private economy, which created jobs for 2 million people. Now, after more than 40 years of development, there are more than 100 million market players, more than 13 million private enterprises. They contribute more than 50% to the investment tax revenue of the whole society, more than 60% to economic growth, and more than 70% to technological innovation achievement. They also contribute 80% to overall employment, as it typically creates most of the new jobs. Therefore, we must recognize that the development of a private economy is our long-term national policy. If you want to develop a socialist market economy, you must insist on developing a private economy and never waver. Give the private economy a good position. China is developing and introducing the private economy promotion law to create a better environment for private economy. I think there will be a new wave of development in the private sector, and I'm confident about this.
新的一个发展的新的浪潮，我对这个还是有信心的。
Madam Chen Wenling, you mentioned about this is the stage of the most challenging stage in terms of the reforms and opening up. Of course, domestically there are challenges, and also externally there are challenges. For example, tariffs from the U.S. and also restrictions of tech exports, chips, etc. How do you look at those challenges?
我觉得现在挑战是蛮严峻的。
I think the challenge is quite serious now. And with Trump being elected president, it may be even more serious. High tariffs, of course, are not just for China. He will impose a 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada, and an additional 10% tariff on China. I think it is a trade war. The first weapons of a trade war are high tariffs. The international environment we are facing is becoming more and more severe and complicated. Under such circumstances, I think China's reform should grasp 3 points. First, we should seize the moment, and the reform should not be delayed. At present, many system and policy designs are not yet implemented, including, for example, our current government debt conversion policy. In order to make it become a fiscal and taxation system, we must now have a specific implementation plan, which should be put forward as soon as possible. Only in this way can we solve the problem of local finance. Second, I think we should make it clear that it is not only China that is pushing forward reform. The Americans will also be doing so. Let's imagine that if Trump can put forward his reform as he wishes, he will reduce 428 government agencies to 99, which means the U.S. government's annual fiscal expenditure will be reduced by more than $2 trillion from more than $6 trillion. Also, the enterprise income tax will be reduced from 25 to 15%. I think that will put a lot of pressure on those of us from the outside. The point is, how can China reform in a better way? China is releasing its economic vitality and fostering new productive forces. And I think it has to compete with the United States regarding the depth and effect of the reform. Thirdly, I think we should insist on our reform and opening up to the outside world. But we must avoid the U.S. path of internal reform and external closure. I think the future competition between China and the U.S. is about who can reform more effectively and create new productivity, and who can open up in a wider way to the global market. I think this is a particularly severe test for us.
我觉得这对我们来说面临着特别严峻的考验。
I wonder, Mr. Chiflin, do you feel the same, that we need to use reform, further reform, to respond to those challenges, in particular from external other countries' tariffs or restrictions of tech, for example? We need to reform and to develop in those areas?
我认为啊，中国的转型成功不仅是中国的事情，是关系世界。
The success of China's transformation matters not only domestically, but also globally. Let's consider Chinese EV exports, for example. The export rates of Germany, the United States and Japan account for more than 60% of their total production. Last year, China's exports of electric vehicles only accounted for less than 12.7% of total production. However, the EU started to practice anti-dumping against China's EVs, which I strongly disagree with. Actually, this kind of consumption reform in China is a good thing for Europe. China has provided Europe with so many opportunities in the process of primary technological innovation and transformation. So now I say that it's important to maintain official talks, but more importantly, we should take the initiative to open up even more to attract more mature foreign enterprises. Therefore, the Chinese government has now made an important decision to open up independently and unilaterally. We'll gradually introduce more unilateral opening measures, which I think is particularly important. Second, just now they said that it's particularly important to seize the time to reform and not just make empty talk. I proposed 18 years ago that the concept of migrant workers should be abandoned. China's reform and opening up will soon have been in place 50 years. There are still 4 years to go. Whether the concept of migrant workers can be abandoned in the 50-year anniversary of reform and opening up has become a structural contradiction. So indeed, we need to reform in a faster way. Not only do Americans push us forward in development, we also need to motivate ourselves to speed up our own reform. Thorough reform should be carried out immediately in action, not just in empty talk.
Mr. Yves Ledam, you mentioned about China-European Union, the relationship, trade relationship, and also the comprehensive agreement on investment. With the further reforming here in China, will that help bring the two sides closer in terms of developing the economy, in terms of a trade relationship?
Whether it will or not, only future will tell. But it's needed if we want a sustainable, balanced development of the both economies, and as a result, a global economy. We need to find a constructive agenda between EU and China. From our side, it was left there in, I think, 2020 with blocking of debates on the comprehensive agreement on investment. So it should treat, this kind of debates should restart. We as European Union, we need your electric vehicles. We need your ways of energy production. And we need your resources. Very typical for the European continent, it is that is worldwide one of the rare places in the world where we almost have no natural resources, and more specifically the resources needed to, let's say, become climate-proof economies. And so there's a need, but we should find a new way, build a level playing field of better interaction and win-win situations between the European and Chinese economy. And I pointed already at agreements on technology transfer, maybe a better definition about what is the vital interest of a sovereign state from the European side. And secondly, we need also to very carefully handle the issue of employment. Today, there is even political instability in Europe created by the concerns of people for their jobs. And the concerns about their jobs are to a certain extent created, can be brought back to the Chinese competition. When you talk to people now in Germany, the same people that will vote in February for a new leadership in Germany, the assessment of their personal situation and their future, their immediate future, is very much linked to the economic situation in Germany, and this is linked to the very important loss of activity in the car industry. And that's only one example. I could give other examples all over Europe. And so to fix this issue, and it is needed to come to a new kind of level of interaction with China, we need a constructive agenda of conversations between the European Union and China. And I hope that from the European side, the new European Commission, the new leadership, will find ways to be a constructive partner in such a new dialogue.
Thank you. And Mr. Sharaf, we also have been following the theme of this important conference, carrying through the reform to the end. There's a strong commitment to reform. How do you look at this commitment?
As I said, it's a very simple answer. Even slowing reform is not a good option. You have to continue the same level, because I believe that a country with a strong economy also can have political influence. So it should be continued, because, as I said, it resembles the character of China. Opening up is a driving force for reform and high-quality development. So you have to actually, taking from the other side, is to have a good reform, good high-level development, and high-standard opening up. I know, as I said, this is, as a model, it should be there. There are problems, yes. We have to deal with it, like the problem with tariffs like retaliation or reconciliation. But the most important thing is how China and European Union can work together. This is that needs some reform. So this is something that to jump over this current problem, you have to widen the landscape of cooperation, especially with Europe.
Well, Mr. Canal, of course, we have tons of problems, challenges, but at the same time, we are at a much, much better stage probably than the previous years, for example. We have solved this absolute poverty issue. We are now much more advanced in terms of cutting-edge technology. So how do you look at these advantages and challenges of next round of reforms here in China?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Actually, the cutting-edge technology in the worldwide scale is developing, particularly in China, it's developing. And in this context, actually, the Western world is trying to curtail everything in socialist country. They are waging sometimes tech war, sometimes trade war, and many kinds of war actually. Sometimes democracy war, etc., etc. That's why. But China is challenging all these type of challenges and strengthening itself. So now I hope that China will surmount all kinds of difficulties actually imposed against the socialist country. So at this time, although China has some problems also, but those problems will solve, and I think all kinds of Western world are imposing one or other kinds of difficulties that will create a new opportunity for socialist country to enhance their new technology, new process. That's why I hope that socialist country will win all these type of problems in the course of time.
Well, Mr. Kabzabo, China is an important member of the developing world of the global south. We mentioned about China's contribution to global economic growth. How important it is for China to continue to maintain strong growth to the global south?
We see today in global trade, when you look at the numbers, trade between China and Africa is growing exponentially and continuously. At some point, the only problem that one faces may be that the exchange becomes very unbalanced. There is the concept of unbalanced development in the economic concept, which means that at a certain moment, if trade is too important and the trade balance of certain countries is very low, it will bring problems in terms of trade. So, I think at this level, the Chinese think that they can transfer technology at the same time. By transferring technology to less developed countries to support their own development, which I think is absolutely necessary. I want to add one thing. Youth unemployment is a big problem worldwide, especially in the underdeveloped countries. Today, there are more and more young people in Africa. Young people under 25 or 30 account for about 60% of the total population, and this number will continue to grow. I think a big country like China should look in this direction a little bit, communicate with these countries to see what can be implemented to ensure that we can reduce the unemployment rate within the goal of 10 to 20 years, and how we can significantly reduce this rate. Because if we don't take this issue seriously, it may pose a very significant danger in the future, which will affect trade with China.
Thank you. Mr. Li Junru, earlier panelists talked about, I think we all agree upon basically the area we need to reform. And also people have this sense of urgency. We need to do the reforms as quickly as possible, as soon as possible. And what do we need to do? You know, if you look at, we still have some time, 1 month probably for this year, and then 2025, what we are going to expect?
我讲讲现在心里的心情要听嘛，我很郁闷，因为我们在这里讲改革、讲发展、讲现代化。
Do you want to hear my true feelings now? I am very depressed because we are talking about reform, development, and modernization here. But people are thinking about how to suppress China, how to stop China from getting advanced technology, not to let China develop. And if we don't discuss this situation, the conversation will be meaningless. I got the information earlier that, starting from January next year, the United States will not allow any investment in China's advanced technology, which means that it's not just technological exchanges which aren't to be allowed, but also investment. The U.S. has already included 136 Chinese semiconductor enterprises in the entity list of export controls. Moreover, any country that does business with these 136 Chinese enterprises will be subject to sanctions. So this situation is very severe. The key solution lies in innovation. Where there is oppression, there is innovation. Chinese people are not afraid of oppression. The Soviet Union suppressed us back then, but we developed the 2 bombs and 1 satellite. Now we are facing reforms under suppression. If they don't allow you to change, or they just want you to collapse, what will you do? My idea is that we should tackle the external pressure with a spirit of innovation. And at the core of comprehensive innovation is educational reform. We should cultivate our own talent. I think if we can start with the reform of the education system and bring up more talent, we will be able to get out of the predicament in the next 5 or 10 years.
从教育制度改革着手，把人才搞出来，那么我们今后的5年、10年，能够走出困境。
That's also part of the reform. You want to innovate, but innovation takes time. Education takes time. So that's one of the challenges, and that will prompt the Chinese side to adopt more reforms. Well, on that note, we are coming to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. And also, thank you for joining us for this very important dialogue, co-produced by CGTN and the China Institute for Innovation and Development Strategy.